everyone, it's Leela with Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created this peekaboo glittered wood grain tumbler. Like always, all of my materials will be posted in my description below, including some links and coupon codes. And for all of my beginner crafters, I will have a beginners playlist for y'all to check out. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this tutorial. I'm starting with this stainless steel tumbler from Makerflow Crafts. I've sanded this tumbler down and wiped it down with 91% alcohol before I added these paints to the tumbler. So the glitter you'll see I show you, it's a sangria glitter, so the color is burgundy or a dark red. So I'm mixing my pop of color paints, my red and my black together to get a nice burgundy color, because I'm going to use this paint to act as an adhesive for my glitter. So I want to make sure that this paint is the same color or similar to the same color as my glitter on the tumbler. So just in case I don't cover that tumbler with all of the glitter that you're going to see here soon, right here from Mass Craft Supply, I just want to make sure that if it does peek through a little bit, that you can see that paint, which is a similar color, instead of seeing like a white base or a black base. So I'm taking that paint and I'm placing it right on my tumbler. I make sure I put a good amount of paint on the tumbler. It's really, I don't measure anything. I just apply it until I'm not able to see most of the stainless steel anymore. And I want to make sure I apply that all over the tumbler, because the areas that the paint isn't on, that's the areas where that glitter won't stick. And before I let this dry, I make sure I go in with my glitter and I place that glitter all over the tumbler. So you want to make sure this paint is still wet, because this paint, like I said, is acting as an adhesive. This is going to allow that glitter to stick to the tumbler like you see in the video. And I always wait until I do the bottom last, because I place the tumbler right side up or I get distracted, I do another tumbler. So I always just do my bottoms last, but if you want to do your bottom at the same time, go ahead and do your bottom, whatever method or way works for you. And once I was finished applying my glitter to the tumbler, I allowed my glitter to dry for about 15 to 25 minutes. I'm just letting that paint dry underneath the glitter, and then we're going to move on to epoxy. I did not seal this with anything. I didn't spray this with any clear spray paint or anything. I'm just simply letting that paint and glitter dry before I add that epoxy coat onto the tumbler. And going in with my epoxy, I am adding 30 milliliters of epoxy to this 20-ounce tumbler. I know that seems like a lot, but this coat of epoxy is very important. You want to make sure that you're adding enough epoxy to this tumbler so that glitter isn't bumpy through that epoxy or it's not rising up through the epoxy. You want to make sure you're adding enough epoxy until you feel that nice smooth tumbler. So once I added the epoxy to my tumbler, this was my fast set epoxy, which will be linked in my description. I allowed my tumbler to spin on the cup turner for about a couple hours, and then my tumbler was dry to the touch. So you want to make sure it is completely dry, your epoxy. If you're using your fast set or your regular epoxy, just make sure before you move on to that next step that your epoxy is completely dried. And once my epoxy was cured, I went ahead and I cleaned up the inside of my rim with an X-Acto knife, and I made sure to remove any excess epoxy. I do this every time I epoxy my tumbler. So during the tumbler steps, I make sure to do this. So you could see me doing this throughout my tumblers, maybe 4 or 5 times, depending on how many times I epoxy. And then I'm going in with a 220 grit sanding block and lightly sanding my tumbler. So this is one of the reasons why you need that nice thick coat of epoxy on that tumbler, because when you go into sand, sometimes if you don't have a thick amount of epoxy on your tumbler, you're going to sand away that glitter and you're going to see that silver like specks all over your tumbler. So you want to avoid that. Make sure you have that nice thick coat of epoxy on your tumbler whenever you're doing the glitter method. And then I'm going in with that 180 grit sanding block and I sand the rim of my tumbler so I can create that nice seal. And once I finish sanding, I make sure to go in with my 91% alcohol, just removing any sand particles or any oils you may have transferred onto your tumbler. And then we're going to move on to my favorite step, which is adding those paints to the tumbler. So you're going to see that I have my 1 ounce cups laid out in front of my paints, and then I'm making 2 wood sticks per 1 regular stick just to save on materials. I'm using apple barrel paints. It does not matter the finish, but I did post those colors on the screen, and I've also posted them in my description for y'all as well. So what I do is I take each color and I add it to the 1 ounce cup. So you want to make sure that all of these colors are separated. We're separating all of these, and then we're going to combine them at the end. In order to allow these colors to run on the tumbler, these paints to run on the tumbler a little bit more easily, is I always water them down. Just add a little bit of water. You don't have to add a lot. You see I'm adding just a little drop to each cup, and then I stir them together, making sure that when you stir them, make sure you mix them completely where that water is completely mixed into the paints and it's not separated in the paints. So give it a nice stir, just stir until those paints are completely mixed, and then we're going to go ahead and add those paints together. And you want to make sure that the consistency of your paints, you have a drip consistency. So that's why I add just a little bit of water. I want to make sure those paints are dripping. That way they will drip down the tumbler with ease. And then I have this 20 ounce tumbler I use for my base or my anchor for all of my dirty pours and drips. I take my tumbler and I place that on top of that base, and I want to make sure that there's a nice space between those tumblers so those paints can freely drip down off of that glitter tumbler. And then I take my white paint and I apply it on my tumbler, and I just want to make sure that I'm applying that white paint everywhere. This is the paint that I added water to. I'm making sure to have a nice white base and to make sure that that paint stays wet, because this is going to allow those paints to drip down the tumbler more easily when you have a wet base compared to a dry base. And then once my tumbler was painted, I took a bigger cup and I poured all of the paints on top of each other. And to that bigger cup, I'm not focusing on which color I'm placing on top of one another. I'm just adding those colors one by one, and you want to make sure you do not stir this big cup. However these paints land in this cup, leave as it is, because this is how we're going to pour it on the tumbler. And then I noticed as I did that, my tumbler dried a little bit, so I went in with more of my paint and I made sure to add a nice coat of paint back onto my tumbler to make sure that I have that nice wet surface before I pour those paints over the tumbler. And then I take that cup and then I pour the paints right on the edge of the tumbler. You can see how quickly those paints run down, especially the fact that I have that white base and that I diluted them with some water. Now you see me taking my wooden stick and just scraping all of that excess paint onto the side of the tumbler to let that paint run down. And here is the result so far. It covered most of the tumbler. There are a little bit of areas that need to be cleaned up, which is fine. I'm going to go in with my silicone stick and take some areas from the paper cup and scoop the paint like a spoon without trying to mix that paint too much and have those paints fall down. So I'm trying to create more of a wood grain look instead of like a dirty pour look. So eventually you'll see that it does look more like a wood grain. Whenever you are scraping that paint, make sure you're not making that paint mix. So you want to keep that paint as separated as possible. So remember that. And remember, if you do not like your drip, clean it up some, scoop some out with that popsicle stick, and just keep adding those paints on top of the tumbler. Or you can always do multiple drips. So I did 2 drips on this tumbler and I just dripped the paint over the first one, and you can see that it makes such a cool effect. And once I finished with my drips and my tumbler was how I want it to look and be, I let my tumbler dry for about 8 hours before moving on to the next step. You want to make sure your tumbler's paint is completely dry before you start with the next step, especially since you're going to epoxy this tumbler in the future, and epoxy does not react well with water or wet paint. So now that this is dry, you can see it is a nice matte finish. The bottom is dry and this design looks really cool on this tumbler. And then you're going to see me clean up the rim with my X-Acto knife. This is the same process I did with cleaning up the epoxy, except for this paint is a lot thinner and it takes a lot less pressure to remove that paint from the rim than it does epoxy. So this is very simple. And then once I clean up the rim with my X-Acto knife, I went in with a 180 grit sanding block, and I also sanded the rim too, just for good measure. I just wanted to make sure that it was a nice and smooth rim and there was nothing like poking out or like sharp edges or anything. And once my rim was nice and smooth, I moved on to the next step, which was removing the paint from that tumbler. So I took some napkins and I cut them in half, and I also cut them in thirds. I'm taking my 91% alcohol and I'm rubbing that alcohol and napkin on that tumbler, removing that acrylic paint. So it's simple as that. You just remove any paint that you like, remove as much or as little as acrylic paint as you like. Don't overthink this, just keep rubbing away and that paint will be removed. I did notice that the 91% alcohol was giving me a hard time. I wasn't getting the paint removed as quickly as I wanted it to be, so I switched to 100% acetone, and I found this to work a lot better. I did have to use gloves for this. Acetone does dry out your hands, so make sure you're using the proper PPE. So this was a lot easier, and I just kept adding that acetone onto the napkin, and I just removed the areas that I wanted it to be removed from. Remember that this is your tumbler, so remove as much paint as you want and don't overthink it. And no matter how much paint you remove or how little paint you remove, I'm sure it's going to look beautiful. And once I was satisfied with my design, after this step, I went right into epoxying my tumbler. I did not have to seal this tumbler at all with anything, so I was finished with the acetone. I waited about 5 minutes to make sure the acetone was dry, and then I went in with my epoxy. And for this 20-ounce tumbler, I used about 15 milliliters of epoxy total. The reason why I didn't use that much is because I decided not to add a decal to this tumbler, and I already used so much epoxy for that glitter base that I really just needed this epoxy to sit on top of this design just to seal in that paint and to just make that tumbler come to life and really shine. So I didn't have to use that much epoxy. If I were to add a decal, I would probably use 10 milliliters of epoxy total, add my decal, and then put another 10 milliliters of epoxy over that decaled tumbler. After adding my epoxy to my tumbler, I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 4 hours. Then I turned off my cup turner and I let my tumbler air dry or air cure for another 20 hours with my total drying time of 24 hours. And you can remove your tumbler from the tumbler turner during this 20-hour drying time. Once my epoxy was completely cured, you can see how gorgeous this tumbler is. I absolutely love this sangria glitter from Masscraft Supply. It looks so beautiful with this light brown wood grain. Look at that shine. This tumbler is so fun to make and so many possibilities with this style tumbler. I cannot wait until I see what you guys come up with. So before this tumbler is finished, I want to make sure that I clean up that rim one more time. So I take my X-Acto knife and I cut any excess epoxy or any paint on that rim, just so I can apply or place that lid on that tumbler nicely with no problem. If you have any questions on how to clean up your tumbler's rim, again, I have that beginner's help playlist in my description, and there is a video on how to clean up the rim and the inside of your tumbler. And here is that finished product. I hope you guys enjoyed this tumbler tutorial as much as I enjoyed creating it for y'all. And if you did, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.